All right, today we're taking a deep dive into a really complex topic, the life and legacy of Steve Biko, and how his story intersects with the South African legal system both during and after apartheid. Um, we've got a fascinating mix of sources for you today: news articles, excerpts from Wikipedia, even some glimpses into his early life from a Google Arts and Culture exhibit. So,
Yeah, it's a story that highlights some stark realities about injustice and the long struggle for accountability.
exactly. And what really struck me is that despite clear evidence of brutality in Bito's death, no one was ever held legally responsible. And then years later, you have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission trying to grapple with the wounds of the past. So much to unpack there. But before we get into all that, let's start with the basics for anyone who might not be familiar with his story. Who was Steve Biko?
Steve Biko was an anti-apartheid activist. He became a leading voice in the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. Born in 1946 and tragically died in police custody in 1977 at just 30 years old.
His given name was actually Bantu Stephen Biko. I found it interesting that Bantu means people in the Nguni languages. Seems like even his name foreshadowed his philosophy of community and shared humanity.
Absolutely, you're right. That emphasis on community and shared humanity. It was central to his rejection of the divisions imposed by apartheid. He challenged not only the political structures of apartheid, but also the psychological impact of racial oppression on Black South Africans.
Really powerful stuff. Speaking of challenging the system, his death in 1977 sparked international outrage and really put a spotlight on the brutality of the apartheid regime. And this is where the legal system comes in. What can you tell us about the circumstances of his arrest and what led to that inquest in 1977, the one that human rights lawyer Tembeka Nkuka called a complete charade?
Well, at the time of his arrest, Biko was actually under a banning order, which was a common tactic used by the apartheid government to silence dissidents and activists. It severely restricted his movements and activities. Essentially, he was confined to his hometown, and forbidden from speaking publicly or even meeting with groups.
So even basic acts of free speech and assembly were criminalized.
Exactly. These banning orders were designed to isolate individuals, limit their influence, and prevent any organized resistance to the apartheid state. In Biko's case, he was arrested while traveling to Cape Town.
What was he doing in Cape Town? Was he participating in some sort of protest?
He was actually trying to meet with other activist groups working for liberation, seeking to build bridges and create solidarity across different organizations fighting against apartheid.
And that was enough to get him arrested. It seems almost absurd now.
It does, but that was the reality of apartheid. Any attempt to challenge the state, even through peaceful means, was met with severe repression. And what happened to Biko after his arrest is truly horrifying.
Yeah, the details of his treatment in custody are really tough to read. Can you share what happened?
He was held naked, shackled, and subjected to relentless interrogation for 22 hours straight. The security police beat him so severely that he sustained significant brain damage. He was eventually transferred to a prison hospital hundreds of miles away, but by then it was too late.
Just heartbreaking. And despite all the evidence of this torture, the inquest concluded that no one was responsible.
Not a single person was held accountable. The magistrate actually accepted the police's claims that Biko's injuries were self-inflicted during a scuffle. It was a complete whitewash, a blatant attempt to cover up the truth.
So, if even overwhelming evidence of brutality wasn't enough to bring charges against the officers involved, what does that tell us about the South African legal system under apartheid?
This inquest tragically wasn't an isolated incident. It really exposes how the legal system itself was a tool to protect the state and uphold the system of white supremacy rather than delivering justice. Black South Africans were systematically denied basic human rights and legal protections.
Which makes Diko's work to empower Black South Africans even more crucial. It wasn't just about dismantling the external structures of apartheid, it was about dismantling the internal ones too.
Precisely, and this is where his ideas about psychological liberation and Black consciousness become so important. He recognized that true freedom required more than just political change.
And that's something we'll definitely dive into deeper in just a moment. It's incredible to think about the impact of Biko's ideas, especially given the immense pressure he was under from the apartheid regime. They clearly saw his movement as a serious threat. Why was that? What made his message so dangerous to those in power?
I think what made Biko so dangerous was that he was calling for a fundamental shift in consciousness. He wasn't just asking for political reforms or a seat at the table within the existing power structures. He was demanding a complete reevaluation of Black identity and self-worth. He argued that true liberation required Black people to free themselves from the mental chains of oppression, to reject the feelings of inferiority that were so deeply ingrained by the apartheid system.
And that idea is so beautifully encapsulated in that famous slogan, "Black is beautiful." It went so much deeper than just appearance, didn't it?
Absolutely. And it resonated so powerfully because it was a direct challenge to the racist ideology that underpinned apartheid. Biko wasn't interested in assimilation or integration into a white-dominated society. He was advocating for Black pride, self-reliance, and the creation of a society where Black people could define their own destiny.
He really emphasized the importance of psychological liberation. There's one quote that really stood out to me. He said, "Man, you are okay as you are. Begin to look upon yourself as a human being." It's such a simple statement, but so profound. It's about reclaiming your humanity, your agency, your right to exist and thrive on your own terms.
Exactly. And that was a radical idea in apartheid South Africa,
Hmm.
where Black people were constantly bombarded with messages about their supposed inferiority, their designated place as second-class citizens. Biko was urging Black South Africans to reject those messages, to see themselves as equals, to understand their inherent worth and potential.
And I think that's why his ideas are still so relevant today, because even though apartheid has ended, we're still struggling with the legacies of racism and oppression all over the world.
You're absolutely right. The fight for psychological liberation is ongoing. We see it in movements like Black Lives Matter, in the push for representation and equity in all spheres of life, in the ongoing struggle to decolonize our minds and institutions.
It's about recognizing and dismantling the subtle ways that racism continues to operate, even in the absence of explicitly racist laws and policies.
Exactly. And that's what makes Biko's work so powerful. He was talking about these issues decades ago, and his words still resonate with such urgency today.
We touched on this earlier, but I want to go back to Biko's views on white liberals. He had a complex relationship with them, didn't he?
He did. Biko rejected the idea that white liberals could or should lead the struggle for Black liberation. He believed that Black people needed to be at the forefront of their own movement.
Which makes sense given his emphasis on Black self-reliance. But he didn't completely dismiss the role of white people in the fight against apartheid, right?
No, he didn't. He recognized that white South Africans could play a crucial role. By working to change attitudes and dismantle racist structures within their own communities, he saw them as having a responsibility to challenge the prejudices and assumptions of their own racial group.
So it wasn't about exclusion, but about recognizing the specific spheres of influence and responsibility. It's interesting, I think it connects to this idea of multiple perspectives, which is something we always try to emphasize on the deep dive. It's not about silencing any voices, but about understanding who has the power to make change within particular systems.
It's a really insightful observation,
Yeah.
and it highlights the complexity of navigating these issues of race and power.
Absolutely. Now, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about what happened after apartheid ended. It was a time of tremendous change and upheaval as South Africa began to confront the horrors of the past. How did the country grapple with the legacies of apartheid, and specifically with Biko's death?
One of the most significant developments was the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, in 1995. It is a monumental effort to address the human rights abuses perpetrated during apartheid. Victims were given the opportunity to share their stories, and perpetrators could apply for amnesty in exchange for full disclosure of their crimes.
And Biko's case was a major focus of the TRC, wasn't it?
His death was a symbol of the brutality of the apartheid regime, and there was a strong desire for truth and accountability. However, Biko's family initially opposed the TRC's investigation into his death.
Why was that? Did they not want the truth to come out?
They were actually concerned that the amnesty provisions of the TRC would allow his killers to escape justice. They feared that the focus on reconciliation would come at the expense of accountability.
So they didn't believe that true reconciliation could occur without justice being served?
Exactly. And they took their fight all the way to the Constitutional Court, challenging the TRC's authority to grant amnesty in cases like Biko's. They argued that amnesty should not be granted for gross human rights violations.
That's a really powerful stance. What was the outcome of their legal challenge?
Unfortunately, they lost their case. The Constitutional Court ruled that the TRC was within its mandate to grant amnesty. Even for the most serious crimes, this decision was highly controversial, and it raised a lot of questions about the balance between truth, justice, and reconciliation.
So the TRC was allowed to proceed with its investigation into Biko's death. What happened? Did the officers involved apply for amnesty?
They did. The 5 officers who were directly involved in Biko's death appeared before the TRC, seeking amnesty in exchange for a full confession.
Did they get it? Were they granted amnesty?
No, they were not. Their accounts of the events surrounding Biko's death were so inconsistent, and riddled with lies that the TRC denied them amnesty.
So in a way, that was a small victory for Biko's family and for those who wanted to see his killers held accountable. But even though they were denied amnesty, did they face any legal consequences?
Sadly, no. Due to the statute of limitations and the challenges of gathering sufficient evidence after so many years, they were never prosecuted for Biko's murder.
So even though the truth came out, justice remained elusive. It's a difficult and complex outcome.
It is, and it raises some fundamental questions about the nature of justice and reconciliation. Can you truly achieve reconciliation without accountability? And what are the long-term effects of such trauma, both for individuals and for a nation, when justice is denied?
It's a question that continues to haunt South Africa and many other countries around the world that are grappling with the legacies of violence and oppression.
Absolutely. Biko's story highlights the challenges and complexities of dealing with the past. And seeking justice for historical wrongs, there are no easy answers.
And it's a reminder that the fight for justice is ongoing even after formal systems of oppression have been dismantled.
Exactly. The fight for equality and human dignity is a continuous process, and it requires constant vigilance and action.
Biko's legacy is complex in other ways too, isn't it? Even within the anti-apartheid movement, there were different interpretations of his ideas and how they should be applied.
That's right. His legacy has been contested and appropriated by various groups, each with their own interpretation of his message and goals. Even the ANC, the party of Nelson Mandela, faced accusations of using Biko's image and ideas for their own political gain.
So even after his death, his legacy became a site of struggle and debate.
Absolutely, which I think speaks to the enduring power of his ideas and the continued relevance of his work.
That makes me wonder, how is Biko remembered today? His message seems more relevant now than ever.
He's remembered in many ways. There's the Steve Biko Foundation, established by his family to carry on his work. They have a fantastic website, a wealth of resources for anyone wanting to learn more. They also host an annual memorial lecture with some very prominent speakers.
I read that Nelson Mandela actually gave a lecture back in 2008.
He did. It was a powerful event. There's also the Steve Biko Hospital in Pretoria, the Steve Biko Center for Bioethics at the University of the Witwatersrand, even a Google Doodle a few years ago commemorating his birthday.
It's really amazing to see how far his legacy has reached, extending beyond South Africa's borders.
It really has. I think it's because his message of self-reliance, psychological empowerment, and challenging oppressive systems resonates far beyond the specific context of apartheid. His work speaks to anyone fighting for social justice and equality, regardless of where they are in the world.
That makes me wonder, if Biko were alive today, what causes do you think he would be championing?
That's a great question to consider given his internationalist outlook. I think he'd be deeply engaged in global issues like poverty, inequality, and climate change. He'd likely be calling out the neo-colonial structures that perpetuate these problems, connecting the dots between local struggles and global systems of power.
And given his history, he certainly wouldn't shy away from speaking truth to power, no matter how uncomfortable it might make people.
Absolutely not. He was fearless in that regard. And I think his voice would be a powerful force for change in a world still grappling with racism, xenophobia, and all forms of oppression.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the life and legacy of Steve Biko. What a journey it's been. His story, his ideas, they really make you think. And for our listeners, we'd love to leave you with a final thought-provoking question. If Biko were alive today, what causes would he champion? How would he use his voice to fight for justice and equality in a world still full of inequality and oppression?
It's definitely a question worth pondering.
It is. And for those who want to explore Biko's work further, we highly recommend checking out the Steve Biko Foundation website. Or if you're in the mood for some powerful music, give Peter Gabriel's song Biko a listen. You won't regret it. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those critical thinking gears turning.